Welcome back, chess fans. Today we're talking about pawn breaks. Those moments when you push a pawn to challenge your opponent's structure. They're super important because they open lines for your pieces, create chances for attack, and stop the game from getting stuck. Mastering pawn breaks is key to unlocking your position and finding winning plans. Let's dive in and enjoy the video. Okay, so let's start by defining what pawn breaks are. Pawn breaks in chess are the kind of pawn moves that we play when we want to open up a position. So for example, if we were to play this move f4, what this move aims to do is open up this file for the rook. It also takes more space and it also restricts certain ideas and moves from the black side. For example, black is now unable to play this move d5 because if black were to play this move, we would simply capture the pawn on e5 and then go d4, and then from here the game continues. We are able to take more space. If we were to not play this move, and if we were to play a move like h3, black is able to strike in the center and black is able to equalize the game. This is an example of a pawn break in chess. However, a pawn breakthrough is something like this. Whenever we have a position like this and we want to promote our pawn and we want to get one of our pawns past the defense of the enemy pawns. So in this case, we would play a move like pawn to g6, captures, we would go f6, and then we would push this pawn to promotion. This is a pawn breakthrough, not a pawn break. The intent of a pawn breakthrough is to create a passed pawn. Intent of a pawn break, such as this one right here, is to activate your position. So these are two different topics, and today we will be talking about pawn breaks, and pawn breakthroughs will get a separate video. So let's get started. Okay, so there is this one concept that I want to introduce to you guys, and that is called the rule of the chain. Now in this position, as you can see, after e5, this becomes an advanced French position. Let me show you the position from the beginning. It's just a French defense, and it's one of the advanced French variations. After knight f to d7, white plays f4, and black plays c5. Now, why does white play this move and not knight f3? Why does black not play knight c6, and why does he play c5? And that is because of the rule of the chain. Now, we need to take space in this position, but how do we know where we need to take space? In chess, you want to play on the side of the board where you are stronger. And generally, you're going to be stronger on the side of the board where your pawn chain is looking towards. So as you can see, this pawn chain starts from f7, goes to e6 and d5. It starts from f7 and goes this way. This pawn chain, the white pawn chain, starts from d4, but okay, let's assume it starts from b2 and there's like some sort of c3 played. This pawn chain starts from here and it goes this way. So a natural follow-up for the white pieces is this move f5 after a couple of preparatory moves. But for black, it's the other way around. The pawn chain is looking this way, so black wants to go this way. And this is a universal law in chess that works in almost every position that is closed or at least semi-closed or semi-open. And in this case, black wants to play this move c5. If black plays a move like knight c6, he will be severely restricted. Now, let me show you another example of this, and that is this one right here. So as you can see, this is a King's Indian defense. I can show you the whole game from the beginning. This is all theoretical stuff. The link to the study is going to be in the description. And as you can see here, black's pawn chain is going from c7 to d6 and e5. So it's looking this way, so black wants to follow up this way with a move like f5, while white's pawn chain is going like this. You have to look at the central pawns to determine exactly where the pawns are going, and the central pawns are looking this way. But imagine there's also like a pawn structure that goes from g2, f3, e4, d5, so white's pawns are looking in this direction. So a natural follow-up for white is going to be c5 once again after a couple of preparatory moves. So white, for that specific reason, plays this move pawn to a3. Black plays f5, going with the chain, following the chain, and white also pushes b4, preparing the c5 pawn advancement, once again following the chain. As I mentioned earlier, the primary purpose of pawn breaks is to activate your pieces. So in this case, after a move like h6, we would play a move like d4, striking in the center. What this does is it basically challenges this pawn on e5, and it tries to get rid of this pawn, and it tries to recapture the pawn in the center. So our knight that's on f3 ends up in the center of the board, where it is a little bit more active and controls better squares. If the black knight captures, now we develop our queen, and now our queen becomes more active instead of our knight, and of course this is not very good for the black pieces. Now let me move to another example. So I will go to a different chapter here, and we have a position like this. So what do we do in a position like this? Every single file is closed or semi-closed. So how do we activate the position? First of all, there is a tension between bishops. We don't necessarily want to allow black to take our bishop and double our pawns. That would not be that useful for us. So we can capture this pawn on, not pawn, but the bishop on d6. Even if he took, that would also be fine, most likely. But to be principled, let's capture the bishop on d6. And here we can use a pawn break to activate our position. As you can see, this bishop right here is blocked on the diagonal. This rook is also blocked on the e-file. However, we can use one single pawn move, one single pawn break, in order to activate both of these pieces, and that move is this move f3. And after f3, black is forced to capture this pawn, otherwise he's going to lose the pawn, right? Because if black pushes, we take. If black defends, we take, and then take on next move, we win a pawn. So black wants to take this pawn on f3. He does not have a choice if he wants to keep all of his material, and now we end up in a slightly better position because we have activated our bishop, we have activated our rook, and next move we will be able to infiltrate and double our rooks on the e-file most likely. But what I want you guys to notice is this f3 move that activated, this pawn break activated both our bishop and our rook. Pawn breaks can also be used to gain certain squares. So in this position, the correct move is this move, pawn to b5. And what this move does is it challenges the c6 pawn, and whether black pushes the pawn or whether he captures on b5, white is able to plant the knight on d5 and get to this very useful d5 outpost. Now this is not immediately winning, however it is definitely a better practical endgame for the white pieces because of the way pawns are set up. Pawns are fixed on the dark squares. Black has a dark square bishop, and white has a very nice outpost on d5. So this is another use of pawn breaks. Another use for the pawn breaks is to get rid of your weaknesses. So in this case, as you can see, we have this pawn on a3, which is an isolated pawn. So what we can do is push this pawn to a4. Wait, it's black to move. Now we can push this pawn to a4. And the best move for the black pieces is actually to play a5 here and stop our pawn advancement. However, in a lot of cases, your opponents might not be able to understand the positional intricacy of pushing this pawn to a4 and a5. They might play a random move, such as bishop to c6, but in this case we have this threat. So when we played a4, we had a very direct threat, and the threat was to play a5. Now what happens after we play a5? We are successfully able to push our pawn to this square, and we are successfully able to trade off our isolated pawn, but additionally we are also able to activate this rook without having to move it. So this rook becomes very active because once this pawn takes on b6, the rook opens up, the a-file opens up. So this is pretty cool. The pawn break activates the pieces, and we also get rid of our weak pawn. And this also can apply to doubled pawns. So let me go to this chapter right here. In this position, we can play a move like c5 in order to try to trade off this doubled c pawn. Now white might play b5 here and go for a position like this, but this does allow us to open up our rook and activate our rook. But if white doesn't do that, let's say white plays a move like king f2, then we can simply capture the pawn. If white defends the pawn, then I mean we still capture and we still have a decent position. We also have bishop e5, so maybe there are some tactical opportunities. I'm not exactly sure right here, but the point is you can use the pawns, you can use pawn breaks to get rid of your weaknesses and actually turn them into strengths, and also get rid of doubled pawns. You can also use pawn breaks in chess in order to open up your opponent's king. So in this position, you can play a move like h4. Let's say black plays knight b to d7. You can continue with h5, trying to take on g6 and open up the h-file. Let's say black takes on h5. You can even follow up with g4 and gambit the pawn on h5 in order to get this semi-open h-file. And this is very powerful because we are trying to get an attack. But of course, if black did not capture this pawn at any moment, we could have traded, and probably f takes is going to be better in this position, and then we can still go bishop to h6 and continue attacking on this side of the board. Let me actually show you another example from one of my own games, like this one right here. This is a game I played maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it was the Pierce defense. And here in this position, we had opposite side castling, and we both started pawn storms, and we both started attacking each other's kings. So I was actually faster because, you know, I'm playing with the white pieces, and generally white is going to be faster when it comes to these sorts of attacks. And I played this move pawn to f5, which was not actually the best move, but it's what I chose to play during the game. And then I played h5, and after g6 and h6, I was able to fully break apart my opponent's structure and get to his king. So pawn breaks are an excellent way of attacking your opponent and opening up your opponent's king. Not all pawn breaks are good in chess though. So in this position, as you can see, the most played move according to the Lichess database is this move pawn to f4, which turns out to be a huge mistake. Now, why is this move such a big mistake? First of all, it is a pawn break and it does activate your rook. Once you capture on e5 or push the pawn to f5, you would be able to activate your rook. The problem is black can capture on f4, and what this does is it activates your opponent's bishop, but it also activates your opponent's knight. So you are activating only your rook while also activating two of your opponent's pieces, and this knight that's on d7 finds a great home on this e5 square. After a move like bishop takes f4, knight to e5 can be played, and even if you capture this knight and get this structure, the problem is, yes, you do have the protected passed pawn, which is going to be good in the long run, but you lost the dark square bishop, and the dark square bishop is quite good because all of your central pawns are on light squares, so you are going to have a little bit of a dark square issue on the board. So that's why f4 is not a good move, and you always have to be aware of pawn breaks like this. You have to ask yourself, am I activating my pieces? If the answer is yes, you have to ask yourself a second question, am I also activating my opponent's pieces? And if you're activating more of your opponent's pieces than your pieces, then that pawn break might not be good at all. So you have to find alternative moves, maybe play a move like f3 and actually try to restrict your opponent rather than trying to be super active and just trying to strike in the center. And a play could go something like this in this position, and you could even start an attack with g4 and h4, for example. This is one way to play this position, but you have to be very careful. Not all pawn breaks are created equal. Now I will show you a couple of common pawn breaks that can happen in various different positions. So for example, in e4, e5 positions, the most common pawn break is going to be d4. So in this case, if we were to play a move like d4, let's say e takes d4, c takes d4, we gain a lot of space with the white pieces. We are even threatening d5, and this is a great position for the white pieces. It's not immediately winning or anything like that, but after d5, e5, we get into a position like this where we have a little bit more space and the position is a little bit more comfortable. So this is something that can happen in e4, e5 positions. Let me move on to this one right here. And this right here is a d4, d5 position. And the most common types of pawn breaks in these positions are c5 and e5 for black, and c4 and potentially e4 for white. I say potentially e4 because it depends on the system that white chooses to play. So let's say e6 and we get into a position like this. And we know that in d4, d5 positions, putting the knights in front of the c pawns is very, very bad. Why is that? That is because if you do this, you're basically not allowing your queen access to the queen side, and you're also not allowing your rook to be activated. Once the bishop moves and this rook gets to c8, it will be behind this c7 pawn, which is not very comfortable. If this pawn is on c5, then it can capture on d4, and the rook that ends up on c8 can always be active, but in this case the rook will not be active later on. So in a position like this, you're basically just going to get smushed and your opponents will simply expand. And if white is successfully able to control e5 as well as c5, then white is pretty much going to have a really strong positional advantage. Let me show you yet another example. This is a Benoni type of position, and here we can play this move a6 with the idea to break out with b5 and even sacrifice the pawn. And the rule of the chain, follow the chain. We go with b5 here, and once this exchange happens, let's say white accepts the sacrificed pawn, this file opens up and our pieces can also get very active, and we have a lot of long-term pressure once we're able to activate our minor pieces, mainly our knight on b8 and our light square bishop as well. We can also activate the queen, and all of the pieces will team up to attack the queen side. And this is actually probably one of the strongest sacrifices or the strongest gambits in chess, this sort of a Benko gambit type of position, and I think I would recommend this against d4 any day of the week. This rook will also go to b8 later on to help out with the attack on b2. So these are some of the more common pawn breaks that can happen in chess. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in the next one. Make sure to let me know what you guys want to see in the comments below. I read the comments quite often, and yeah, that's gonna be it. Peace.